Presentation number 11 in the evolution of socialism is communism or applied Marxism. So far in this series on socialism, we've considered the origins of socialist thought. We've explored Marxism, European social democracy, and American progressivism. We will now consider communism or applied Marxism. Communism is also referred to as applied Marxism. It's essentially putting the theory of Marxism into practice. Three of the most well-known 20th century revolutions will be discussed here in chronological order: the Soviet Union, China, and Cuba. The Soviet Union. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, otherwise known as Nikolai Lenin, was the son of a regional superintendent of schools, ranking as a petty noble in Tsarist society. Ulyanov became radicalized when his older brother, a revolutionary, was arrested and executed for plotting against the life of Tsar Alexander. After receiving a degree of law in 1892, Ulyanov became increasingly involved in revolutionary activities, popular among the young Russian intelligentsia at the time. In 1895, he was arrested and imprisoned for 14 months before being exiled to a Siberian village on the Lena River for 3 years. Many of the exiles accumulated and read Marxist revolutionary literature. It was common for the revolutionaries to take aliases in order to confuse the police. Lenin took his new name from the name of the river Lena. Lenin argued that Marxist proletariat would not rise up to establish a socialist state without the help of a revolutionary group known as the Vanguard of the proletariat. In Lenin's plan, the Vanguard would trigger revolution long before the conditions that Marx anticipated actually existed. In this case, socialism would be imposed on the society by a minority instead of being forced upon the government elite by the majority. Furthermore, Lenin contended that a dictatorship of the Vanguard would be necessary because a large percentage of the population would have to be proletarianized or eliminated before the Marxist utopia could be realized. The Russian Revolution of 1917 saw the overthrow of the Imperial Romanov dynasty. Lenin and the Bolshevik Party took control of Russia under a workers' revolution. So we can see that communism, or applied Marxism, evolved from Marxism. When the revolutionary change envisioned by Marx did not occur, Lenin, with his vanguard of the proletariat, seized control of the government in a violent revolution. Lenin's Bolshevik Party called for destroying the stock exchange and nationalizing the banks. Workers were instructed to take over factories and peasants to occupy private farms. Private property such as land and homes were seized by the revolutionaries. This led fairly rapidly to economic disaster. Poor management and unwilling workers, combined with peasants resistant to confiscation and collectivization of their crops, led to widespread shortages and famine, causing starvation that claimed 5 million lives and subjected another 30 million to malnutrition. This toll forced the United States to interrupt its policy of antagonism toward the new state. Herbert Hoover was sent to administer a relief program that fed 10 million people. Eventually, Lenin was forced to claim that the party had made serious errors in their attempt at immediate and complete socialization, and he announced this new economic policy, or NEP, that called for a temporary and partial recapitalization of certain segments of the economy. Upon Lenin's death in 1924, Joseph Stalin rose through the ranks to become General Secretary of the Communist Party. Lenin's suspicion that Stalin was more interested in his own quest for power than the revolution were confirmed. By 1929, Stalin consolidated his power through bloody purges. He ruthlessly executed his rivals, along with hundreds of thousands of his party comrades and millions of Soviet citizens. Stalin ended Lenin's NEP and began a series of 5-year plans to modernize and industrialize the country. These programs call for nationalization of all industries, trades, and occupations, and included collectivization of farms. It also forced enormous sacrifices on the Soviet people so that resources could be diverted from production of consumer goods to the military and heavy industry. The forced collectivization of farms and the sacrifice of consumer goods caused incredible misery and millions of deaths. During post-World War II, the Iron Curtain descends on Eastern Europe. In the final stages of the war, as the Nazis retreated into Germany, one country after another fell under Soviet control. These countries found that liberation from the Nazis was simply the first step in the imposition of a new, equally restrictive Soviet regime. Referred to as satellite states, these countries were harnessed to the Soviet reconstruction and defense effort. Under the rhetoric of exporting the principles of socialism to these countries, Stalin forced the satellites to contribute heavily to the Soviet economy and postpone their own recovery. Following Stalin's death in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev came to power. He attacked Stalin before the party Congress, listing Stalin's crimes, many of which Khrushchev himself helped commit. He called for the de-Stalinization of the Soviet Union and proclaimed Stalin a non-person. References to him were dropped from the history books, and his monuments, statues, and pictures were removed. Khrushchev's reforms included moving away from a single leader rule by giving the Communist Party Politburo more control. He modernized the party by replacing Stalin's cronies with sophisticated technocrats. Censorship was tightened, though instead of executing dissidents, the techniques of imprisonment, exile, and confinement in insane asylums were increasingly used to stifle opposition and criticism. Chinese Communism. The Chinese Revolution overthrew the Manchu dynasty in 1911. Dr. Sun Yat-sen formed the Kuomintang, or Nationalist Party, using it as a base to gain power. The Communist Party of China was founded in 1921 and was attended by a radical young schoolteacher named Mao Tse-tung. The Kuomintang found that China's needs went far beyond their simplistic solutions, and after finding no help from the United States or Western Europe, Sun Yat-sen turned to the Communists, creating a Communist Kuomintang alliance in 1924. The purpose of the alliance was to break the power of the reactionary provincial warlords who governed the far-flung provinces of China for centuries. Sun Yat-sen died in 1925, and one of his lieutenants, Chiang Kai-shek, took power. As his armies began to successfully centralize power, he began to think about eliminating his troublesome communist allies. In 1927, he attacked the Communist Party members and executed all that fell into his hands. The remaining communists fled from the cities into the provinces. Mao Tse-tung was one of those communists who fled to his native Hunan province in the southeast. He believed that the rural peasants were the true revolutionary force. His ideological skill, leadership ability, and shrewd political judgment made him one of the leading Communist Party members. He spent the next several years experimenting with different land redistribution plans and other ways of winning support of the peasants in the provinces. Eventually, civil war broke out between the Communists and the Kuomintang army led by Chiang Kai-shek. The Communists, on the verge of annihilation, began the 6,000-mile long march from 1934 to 1936, fleeing to northern China. Hostilities were suspended by the Japanese invasion and would not resume again until after World War II. Finally, in 1949, the Communist forces won, and Chiang Kai-shek fled to the island province of Taiwan. Millions are executed in purges. Under the Chinese Communist Party, collectivization of large estates by the peasants began. Landlords who owned the large estates were the initial targets of quote-unquote social reform, followed by the warlords who were accused of long-standing exploitation of the peasants. 3 million people were executed in the ensuing purges. The next task was to socialize the economy. Mao had his own 5-year plans, the first of which was 1953 to 1957, and it was designed to achieve economic centralization. Its goals were to increase heavy industry production, to socialize light industry and retail enterprises, and to finalize collectivization of the farms. Resistance to socialization in light industry and retail enterprise grew and was met with brutal force. Again, hundreds of thousands were executed. Central control was problematic in a country the size of China, and Mao would periodically re-announce new initiatives to improve the system and to increase production, such as the Great Leap Forward of 1958. Each initiative was accompanied by purges and executions. By the mid-1960s, the Great Leap Forward was failing. Production had fallen drastically, and famine threatened the stability of the regime. In 1966, resentful of moderate influence, Mao called for the rededication to the revolution, a cultural revolution, and a purge of the reactionaries who were destroying the movement. Inspired by Mao, youthful radicals formed units called the Red Guard, who took over government headquarters and proceeded with sham trials, condemning thousands of quote-unquote counter-revolutionaries to death. Striking out against moderation, many intellectuals, bureaucrats, and non-radicals were executed. The Red Guard made the whole society captive to its destructive fanaticism. By 1969, the situation had gotten so extreme that even Mao admitted that things had gone too far. The Cultural Revolution ended as it had started, with bloodshed when the army was turned against the Red Guard. Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution. Castro, a well-educated man, began the practice of law in Havana and seemed to be on his way to becoming part of the small elite class that controlled most of the wealth in the Cuban economy. However, his radical tendencies were set into motion by the return to power of the brutal dictator Fulgencio Batista after an 18-year absence. In 1953, at the head of a small revolutionary group, Castro tried unsuccessfully to seize a military installation and was captured and imprisoned. Released from prison in 1955, Castro went into exile in Mexico and trained a small group of revolutionaries to invade his homeland. In 1956, he and his small party landed in Cuba. After fighting with Batista's forces, and greatly reduced in number, Castro and his band went into hiding in the mountains of the Oriente province. Castro began to build a following with the peasants there, to whom he promised reform and land redistribution. In time, his partisan army grew and took an ever-increasing toll on the unpopular Batista and his forces. Finally, the Batista government collapsed in 1959, leaving the capital open to occupation by Castro's forces. Unquestionably a leftist, Castro was almost certainly not a Marxist during his days in the Oriente Mountains. Indeed, the Cuban Marxists ignored him until very late, coming to his side, along with almost every other anti-government group, only after he had begun to succeed. In 1961, after hesitating for 2 years, Castro proclaimed that he was a Marxist-Leninist. He set the goal of rapid industrialization, which was an almost impossible task for Cuba. His regime was met with one enormous disaster after another. With production falling drastically, severe rationing became necessary. The situation was so desperate that the Soviet Union had to come to Cuba's rescue, with hundreds of millions of dollars per year in aid. Castro's non-institutional personal rule, lacking party organization, was totalitarian and brutal in its tactics for dealing with dissent, resulting in many executions and imprisonments. The economist Ludwig von Mises, in his book on socialism, wrote on communism and applied Marxism and dictatorship. He wrote that communism or applied Marxism is the takeover of a society by a minority vanguard of the revolution, which imposes a dictatorship until the conditions are met for a presumed Marxist utopia. Furthermore, he said that history has shown us that men of purely totalitarian intent have used this philosophy to gain the cooperation of the uneducated, impoverished masses, to seize power for themselves, and to then subjugate the masses to their dictatorial control. Key points for Section 11 on communism or applied Marxism. Communism or applied Marxism was forced on societies by a vanguard of revolutionaries who formed dictatorships to usher in a socialistic state. They imprisoned and executed those who opposed them. History has shown us that men of purely totalitarian intent have used this philosophy to gain the cooperation of the uneducated, impoverished masses, to seize power for themselves, and then to subjugate the masses to their dictatorial control. Communism or applied Marxism, or revolutionary socialism, has led to the death of an estimated 100 million people during the 20th century in the countries where it had been tried. Communism or applied Marxism has a perfect record of economic and social failure, resulting in economic collapse, deprivation, starvation, and death.